Hello, in this video we're going to go over Alvin Plantinga's article, The Boethian Compromise. So in this article, Plantinga develops a theory in the tradition of Frege where he wants to develop a version of senses that is meant to avoid some of the criticisms that are levied against Fregeanism by Kripke in Naming and Necessity. So what Plantinga proposes is that rather than identify senses with descriptions the way that Frege or other Fregeans like Russell seem to do. Instead, we should identify senses with a kind of property known as an individual essence, or sometimes referred to as a hexaity, but we'll just call them individual references. So an individual essence is a property that an individual possesses, and only that individual possesses, if anyone's going to possess the said property. So Plantinga defines individual essences as following. He says, a property P is an individual essence under the conditions that P, the property, is instantiated or had by some individual X in a world such that for any other world, property P cannot be instantiated by some individual in that other world unless that individual in that other world is identical to X in the actual world. So they have to be the exact same individual. So in other words, individual essences are properties that are held or instantiated uniquely by individuals in, let's just say, the actual world. And if they are going to be instantiated at all in any other possible world, they can only be instantiated by the individual that has them in the actual world. So in other words, the individuals in these other possible worlds that possess these individual essences are going to have to be identical to the individuals in the actual world that initially have these properties. That's why they are essences. They can't be had by anything else. They say something, they express something essential about these individuals in question. And ultimately, Plantinga maintains that proper names express individual essences rather than these traditional descriptive or even definite descriptions that contents that Frege and other individuals like Russell claim that proper names express. So again, Plantinga's motivation for developing this view is because obviously he finds some of the ideas proposed by Frege to hold some kind of weight, but he also thinks that Kripke's criticisms against Frege are, in fact, do hold some water there as well. So in order to avoid this, he develops this new view. But it's not just that he's developing this new view for the sake of avoiding Kripke's criticisms against descriptivism in general. He is also developing this view because he has certain metaphysical commitments, but he thinks that there is some evidence to suggest that proper names do in fact express properties, even individual essences, the way that he's describing them. So he's going to make this case in the paper, but he thinks, look, whenever, there are certain types of properties that are already implied, we could say, whenever somebody uses a proper name. So one such property that is implied when somebody uses a proper name is something like being self-identical, right? I mean, this is not a interesting property by any means, but he thinks that this seems to be, if anything, is a candidate for a property that is expressed or implied. We could say by proper name usage, it's the property of being self-identical. But in addition, there are other more interesting types of properties that are expressed by proper names. So for example, take the name Quine. When somebody uses the name Quine, the property of being self-identical with Quine is also expressed by that name. Plantinga wants to maintain. Well, what is his evidence for suggesting that proper names also express these more, we'll say, interesting types of properties? Well, let's consider the fact that it is metaphysically impossible for someone other than Quine to bear or stand in the identity relationship to Quine, right? Why? Well, because every individual is identical to themselves and to no one else. Therefore, it has to follow from that that it would be impossible for some other individual to instantiate the property of being identical with Quine, unless that individual is Quine, because no one else can possess that property unless they are identical to Quine. The only person that's identical to Quine is Quine. And this is exactly what Plantinga claims individual essences are. They are properties that, if they are instantiated at all, or if they are had or possessed by anyone at all, then they are had necessarily by that individual. And it would be impossible for any other individual to instantiate them unless that other individual is identical to the individual in question, the person who possesses them. So given this rationale and given what we said about the metaphysical necessity of identity, it follows that a property like being identical with Quine is an individual essence in the vein of what Plantinga is trying to propose. And again, it seems intuitive that when somebody uses the name Quine, one thing that is implied is that the individual in question is identical to themselves, to Quine, the person being mentioned with the usage of that name. Now, the more substantive claim that Plantinga wants to make is that in addition to these types of like uninteresting properties that he just mentioned, proper names also express what he'll call world index properties. And it's these world index properties that, again, are also individual essences. So world indexed properties are going to be more robust types of properties that are had by individuals at particular worlds, right? So in other words, they are indexed to particular worlds in question. So if Plantinga is successful in developing this coherent theory, then what ultimately he's going to be able to do is he's going to be able to provide a semantics within the tradition of Frege in terms of senses and all that stuff that will avoid Kripke style, at least the modal argument style types of criticisms, because now when we would be using proper names in counterfactual situations, we wouldn't run the risk of picking out the wrong individual in another possible world with the name in question. We would be picking out the individual that we are discussing or whoever we are assessing in the actual world. But obviously we're talking about them in this counterfactual situation. So what do these world index properties look like? Well, let's assume that Benjamin Franklin, in fact, was the individual who invented the bifocals. I think that's true. I don't have any reason to doubt that. So let's say he's the individual in the actual world that invented the bifocals. So if he possesses the property of being the individual that invented the bifocals, then he also possesses or instantiates the world index property of being the inventor of the bifocals in the actual world, right? Because if it's true that he did it, then he also possesses the property of having invented the bifocals in the actual world. Now, this property, or let's say world index property, being the inventor of the bifocals in the actual world, counts as an individual essence because it can only be instantiated by Benjamin Franklin and no one else. Well, why is that the case? Well, because while there could be other possible worlds in which Ben Franklin did not invent the bifocals, let's just say it was Bob, whoever, or let's just say John Adams invented the bifocals, there is going to be no world, absolutely no world in which it is not the case that Benjamin Franklin invented the bifocals in the actual world. Because again, if he in fact invented the bifocals in the actual world, then he has the property of inventing the bifocals in the actual world. So there isn't a world, actual or otherwise, in which this isn't the case. So this is something that Benjamin Franklin possesses uniquely, and nobody else possesses this, regardless of what possible world we are talking about. So again, Frege identifies the sense of a proper name like Benjamin Franklin with, let's say, something like the description, the inventor of bifocals. But we saw the problems that Frege ran into, or the problems that criticisms that Kripke levied against him, or descriptivism in general. So Plantinga instead suggests that we identify the sense of the proper name Benjamin Franklin with something like the individual essence being the inventor of bifocals in the actual world. Identifying proper names with individual essences, or in this case, say, identifying the sense of Benjamin Franklin with the individual essence being the inventor of bifocals in the actual world, not only is well motivated because, again, as Plantinga suggests, there's evidence that indicates that names express all sorts of properties, including individual essences, but it also has the added benefit that it's able to avoid the main criticisms that Kripke levied against descriptivism. Why? Well, because if the name Benjamin Franklin expresses this individual essence, or this world index property, if you will, then in counterfactual context, we wouldn't run into the problem where we would pick out the wrong individual or with the proper name in question. Or in other words, the individual essence would determine that Benjamin Franklin would be picked out by the proper name and not some other individual. Why? Because Benjamin Franklin is the only individual that can possess the property, whether it's in this world or in any other world, that can possess the property of being the inventor of bifocals in the actual world. And all that has to do with the fact that Benjamin Franklin did invent the bifocals in the actual world. So, okay, so that concludes this video.